and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. Well, obviously, we're still not able to produce this show from our studios at App TV, but actually that gives me the chance to branch out a little, to record remotely some interviews. And today's guest is actually in New Mexico, Dr. George Sieg, who has agreed to join me, and we're going to talk about some of his research and teaching interests. Dr. Sieg works with popular culture, religiosity, and spirituality on multiple levels, and I'm very happy to welcome George with us today. Hi, George. How are you?
Very good. Thank you, Ozzie. It's very good to be here.
It's wonderful that we have the technology that allows us to do this, because otherwise it'd be very difficult for us to get together for this show. And I'm really happy to have you and have you talk about some of your interests. So I first met you, George, at the 2019 Popular Culture and American Studies Association meeting. And I was blown away with your presence there. You were everywhere at all times, heading up sections, giving papers, and responding to papers. So that demonstrates that you have kind of a wide range of interests. So maybe you could just introduce yourself briefly by talking about what you study, what you write about, what you teach.
Absolutely. I suppose I'll start then, since you mentioned that this is how we met, with the Southwestern Popular Culture Association's conference, because one huge strength there is the availability of unlimited roundtables to participants, and that really does intersect with a lot of my different interests, a central one of which is esotericism, magic, and occultism, which is the area there that I chair. And my doctorate is in the study of esotericism from the University of Exeter's Center for Esotericism, which existed up until 2012, when its founder, Professor Nicholas Goodwin Clark, unfortunately passed away. But I had the honor of being one of his first doctoral students, and that really set my academic research in an interesting direction, because the field of esotericism is very interdisciplinary and in many ways very generalist, although it can lead to specializing in a variety of areas. And so the area that I specialized in drew from my previous master's work in Zoroastrian religion. And so I've focused a great deal on the way dualist worldviews tend to manifest, whether that's in religion or other types of worldviews, be they esoteric or magical or occult, or even apocalyptic worldviews. And so my teaching has really run through numerous different academic disciplines. I started registered as a historian of religion at Exeter before our degree program gained its own designation in esotericism. But so I've kept that focus in the history of religion, but really broadened out through philosophy, which I now teach. Also at, of course, something Southwestern. This is the Southwestern Indian Polytechnic Institute, which is one of the only two federally funded Native American colleges, exclusively Native American, for only Native American students. And so my research interest has really broadened out to include indigenous worldviews, religions, and philosophies. And of course, perhaps most broadly of all, back to how we met, the study of popular culture.
Right. Well, I'm fascinated by esotericism, occultism, and magic, and maybe want to return to that later in the interview. But you mentioned something that's related to that study, and that is apocalypticism. And I think our viewers are probably maybe more familiar with that word, apocalypticism, or apocalyptic themes or literature. And you're actually now working on a book on apocalyptic themes and post-apocalyptic themes. maybe you could just briefly define what apocalyptic means, particularly in the context of popular culture, and what you hope to achieve with this book you're working on.
Well, it means something not necessarily broader in popular culture than it might mean in the study of religion, but something rather different, which then intersects with its original meaning, that of course also persists in popular culture, but often apparently is an explicitly religious trope. In popular culture, as I would suspect viewers, even who are not viewers dedicated to the study of religion, it would be familiar, especially lately, with the great rise in popularity of apocalyptic themed media. Apocalyptic popular representations generally depict either the end of the world, however the world is presented, or some catastrophic social collapse, or some kind of a natural cataclysm, or perhaps supernatural intervention, which crosses over perhaps into the popularized presentation of the original sense of apocalyptic in religious literature, which is certainly closer to the meaning of the term in Greek. People are going to be most familiar with it in its Latin translation, revelation. But we're so accustomed to the use of revelation in sort of casual discourse to refer to perhaps an inspiration or an amazing idea, or like the lightning bolt striking someone with illumination, or the light bulb turning on, that this obscures the original meaning of apocalypse, which was why it was translated as revelation into Latin. The original sense of apocalypse derives from a Greek root literally for uncovering, with the original sense of uncovering either the true pattern of the spiritual worlds, or the true structure of reality, but much more specifically in the context of the original genre of literature called apocalypses. Even at the time, I don't mean by scholars in the late classical world, I mean the texts themselves were often called by their authors apocalypses, and these were Hellenized Jewish texts claiming to reveal, to uncover the hidden meaning specifically of history, given the long-held concerns developed increasingly over time in the Hebrew religion and what later becomes Israelite religion and ultimately Judaism, this intimate concern with the role of the people and their God in and through history, of course often frustrated or perhaps further uncovered by various catastrophic experiences that may have seemed the end of their world. So you can see the crossover of the religious motif with popular representations, but at the time it was very much focused on history and uncovering the meaning of history through some kind of divine interpretation.
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, then when we think about apocalyptic themes, religiously speaking, in an original context, there's sometimes and often maybe always is that eschatological component, that end of the world or end of history component, but the real kind of underlying purpose is to unveil the supernatural and the way the supernatural works through history. But then it sounds like you're suggesting or implying too that in popular culture, the focus becomes more secularized and almost exclusively focused on the eschatological part or the end of history part. Am I misunderstanding you there, or is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a very fair assessment. perhaps with the caveat that the secularized representations don't always have an eschatological structure in the sense of, in a dualistic sense, perhaps necessarily, of creating a completely different world.
Right.
In
A
fact,
new heaven and a new earth, then.
exactly.
Right.
In fact, some of the most secular, and of course, I realize that secular doesn't automatically mean materialistic, but I think in our popular culture, most of the secular apocalyptic literature is, and apocalyptic fiction, really in general. But it is usually, in some sense, quite materialistic, and perhaps then sets the conditions for this other genre, which is really a completely distinct genre, which is the inspiration for the anthology, which you mentioned earlier, and of course, this conversation very much reminds me of some of the issues addressed about the origin of apocalyptic and its development and reception through time, whether in religion, in the case of your article, which I want to thank you very much for contributing, and also a number of other articles, including one by Jennifer Van Hout, focusing on apocalyptic as a worldview and as a way of relating to worldviews through philosophy. But post-apocalyptic is really a quite different genre with different presuppositions, different conditions, and a different character, of course, mainly focusing on whatever world is after the event. And it would appear that for most apocalyptic dualisms, which I would tend to see as a subcategory of this dualistic eschatology in religion, particularly the monotheisms, post-apocalyptic is not a term that is generally used, even though it would be a sensible and coherent term. But it would seem to refer to something that would be regarded as utopian, at least for those who are chosen to be part of it or survive into it. Now, there are utopian post-apocalyptic fictions in the secular popular culture, but they are few and far between compared, of course, to the immensely popular post-apocalyptic wasteland rendered through a variety of cataclysmic and horrific means.
Yeah, so when I think of, and I love the term post-apocalyptic, and I think that's one of the kind of unique things your book is going to offer a glimpse into. So when I think of that as a kind of new type of narrative or different type of narrative, use the word utopia, I tend to think dystopia. It seems most of the movies that try to feature what the world would be like after the cataclysm tend to fall into a dystopic view of what human nature becomes. Is that a trend that you see?
Yeah, that really does seem to be the pattern, such that it's almost, but not quite, a defining feature of the secular post-apocalypse, as if the conception of the apocalyptic event, which I've noticed in academic literature addressing sort of the concept of the cause of the post-apocalypse. Sometimes you can either see or hopefully now hear the event, either with initial capitals or in all capitals, but in many cases, the particular character and nature of the event is either forgotten about or irrelevant to the post-apocalypse. Well, there was almost an event right there. To the post-apocalyptic landscape, whereas the character of the event in the religious apocalypses we're talking about does tend to be supernatural in character,
Right.
and yet also, depending on the apocalypse, sometimes does seem less significant, or even as a bit of a postscript, in terms, I want to be careful how I say this, in terms of the sort of screen time and the focus of the aesthetic and the imagery, maybe even a bit of an afterthought to the uncovering,
Right.
the gradual within the text, although still rather sudden in historical terms, the gradual uncovering of the real meaning of history. So, of course, the apocalypse most Western viewers, I think, will be most familiar with would be the Apocalypse of John, hence
Book of Revelation.
And so, of course, the majority of it is focusing literally on the unsealing of quite a series of calamities or apparent calamities, depending on one's spiritual perspective, which show the underlying structure, very much as was the case with the Hellenistic Jewish apocalypses. Of course, the principal difference seeming to be that their post-apocalyptic condition tends to be more worldly. As a general rule, it does tend to focus on a scenario that perhaps would be post-apocalyptic in our popular culture sense for everyone except for the Jews or whichever group of them inherits mastery of the world, whereas the Revelation of John seems, it would be difficult to describe it as post-apocalyptic for those who don't survive into the new heaven and the new earth,
Right.
because I don't think post-apocalyptic quite captures the enormity of the eternal torment or annihilation, depending on which theology one might prefer for the significance of the lake of fire, for example.
Yeah, so I guess when we shift the focus to the post-apocalyptic setting, we could have one of two outcomes. I'm sure there are more outcomes, but the one seems to be based on hope. That would be more in line with the Book of Revelation that you mentioned. And the other seems to be more in lines of providing a warning for what humankind could evolve into. Is there kind of two directions there that you see in these post-apocalyptic narratives?
In this case, I don't know that I would want to make that a dualism, but I would accord that in the secular post-apocalypses, there are many representations of worse features of human nature.
Okay.
But these narratives generally are vehicles for heroism. So there's, I think, some significance there. They have an appeal for the most part, because although people do seem to appreciate depictions of human vileness quite a bit, it seems, although perhaps increasingly now than in the previous history of popular culture media, in which certainly epic villainy has always been embraced, but the extent to which the details of human depravity are depicted, not necessarily luridly, although often luridly, but even realistically, does seem to be more of a feature of the contemporary post-apocalyptic. But there are still heroic figures, even if they are flawed or anti-heroic. And to me, that's what is consistent between the religious apocalypse and the secular apocalypse and post-apocalypse. Certainly we have secular apocalypses too, disaster films, although I think the book will feature an interesting debate about whether or not this genre, which one contributor, Shane Trayers, who is also a chair at the popular culture conference we were speaking of, by the way, the wonderfully named Chair of Apocalypse, Dystopia, and Disaster, has suggested that the disaster film is really a genre of impending doom. She was calling it pre-apocalyptic, but impending doom sounds so much more epic and so much like these films that tended to appear around the millennium. That
well, let me jump in there and ask you and shift gears just a little bit. The phrase impending doom.
Well, I want to credit her for that's her phrase.
That's her phrase. Okay.
But it leads into perhaps a debate about whether or not there is such a thing as a truly apocalyptic narrative in secular media. I tend to maintain that there is. That
Okay.
disaster movies where it's averted or survived don't quite count, but that you can find depictions of a secular destruction of the world. There just might not be so many, but they do exist, and I think should be credited as such. But really then, the feature we're talking about, this dualism of moral character, seems to appear in all 2 or 3 categories, depending on how you like to divide it up, because after all, in the monotheist religious apocalypses we're using as examples, there is also a very strict division of moral character between those who are saved and those who are not.
Right.
Well, it's just that in the secular version, those who are not of a moral character are around to continue raking woe on others. This might explain quite a bit of the amazing appeal and success of the epic super multi-volume Left Behind series, whose numeration puts triple trilogies to shame. So I mean, it's immensely successful as a dramatic structure.
It has tapped into I think some fears or aspirations that are prevalent in our culture. And speaking of that, I wanted to ask you too, this kind of surreal situation that we find ourselves in now with the COVID-19 pandemic, in some ways has the feel of an apocalyptic drama. I mean, we see images of empty city streets. Sometimes we even see wildlife roaming empty city streets. We see healthcare providers with personal protection equipment on. Is there a sense in which this pandemic, do you think, has tapped into fears that we would associate with a sense of doom or impending doom, and could be called apocalyptic in nature in any way?
Absolutely. Almost in a literal life imitates art way. The 2011 film Pandemic, I don't know if you're familiar. I would think, and I would think many of the viewers will be, given that its popularity has risen so much during this pandemic, that Wikipedia, the last time I looked, even mentions this specifically as a popular culture sort of event, not the event, fortunately, but an event. And so the fact that the details of this pandemic match so closely, although fortunately the symptoms are greatly reduced in severity and are rather gradual compared to the encephalitic type reactions depicted in Pandemic. I'm thinking that's not really that much of a spoiler considering how it starts, for those of you who have not seen it. But that, I really tend to think that more than any fictional media factor has perpetuated an apocalyptic overlay. But regardless of which specific piece of fiction was accessible, I would have been unsurprised if something of this magnitude didn't activate the sort of underlying apocalyptic features remaining in the Western and indeed now a global worldview, considering that the global worldview is layered onto what was once Western, which seems to be an alternate and a sort of problematically chosen name for what was once Christendom, which I think says it all right there. We talked about the original apocalyptic and the contemporary, didn't really mention much about what was in between, but of course, throughout the Middle Ages and even into the early beginnings of the early modern period, anytime there was a calamity, even on a local scale, there were immanentist apocalyptic expectations and eschatological projections activated with immense severity that generally led And there's a wonderful book on this by Norman Cohn called Pursuit of the Millennium, which generally led over and over and over again to popular assaults on Jews that often had to be restrained by the church or the local aristocracy, if possible, not always possible. Later in the early modern period, this was kind of expanded to accusing witches, lepers, secret Muslim, crypto-Muslims who are agents of the King of Granada. I mean, it really becomes quite elaborate and tied into a whole other topic of conspiracism, which we naturally can also see already blossoming during this pandemic. And
Absolutely.
The presence of that really intensifies the apocalyptic character. It's interesting that in contemporary times, perhaps because of pervasive secularism, many disasters haven't activated an apocalyptic ambiance like this. Instead, they often have activated what Rebecca Solnit, who also wrote a whole book on this, calls disaster euphoria. Things like the San Francisco earthquake, for example, the early part of the 20th century. People, despite devastation, would often have an elated sense of communitas, but it's difficult to have communitas when even being like between 6 and 14 feet from someone could be dangerous, of course.
Right.
Although we see this displayed to some degree in the YouTube videos of Italians singing together on their balconies, things like this. But once there is, but it's also been found by disaster sociologists that once human agency or human negligence is in any way associated with the character of and the causation of a disaster or some kind of catastrophe, usually any type of euphoric effect vanishes and is likely replaced by a combination of paranoia and animosity, which certainly does seem to be the order of this pandemic, at least the way it's being received in the United States, unfortunately enough.
Yeah, and I think that's really kind of an insightful comment or an insightful commentary on what we're feeling right now and experiencing. And this is fascinating, George. I unfortunately, we're out of time. And I feel like we've just scratched the surface. I'm wondering, would you be willing to join us next week for a second installment?
I would be delighted. I've really been enjoying this conversation and certainly had no idea. I my clocks are either somewhere else or face down. I had no idea that we had ended the time.
Well, I think when you're talking about interesting things, the time goes by.
It does. I really enjoyed a chance to talk with you. It's one thing to enjoy writing back and forth about your contribution to the volume, but to get to talk to you at some length, it's really been a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And we'll just, we'll end this here, but be back next week.
I'll really be looking forward to it.
All right.
See you next week.
All right. Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this episode. I hope you will join us next week again, and we'll welcome Dr. George Sieg back to continue to talk about apocalypticism and perhaps esotericism and occultism in our culture. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.